I'm Samartha, and this is the RF sensing for space domain awareness, which has become a global issue in recent years. So, what is the importance of RF sensing in space domain awareness? With the increase of GPS technologies and technologies like Starlink, the space domain has become increasingly crowded, and there is increased demand to actually mitigate risks in space, such as collisions and interference. And there's limitations of traditional methods like telescopic observations, and which do not provide enough information about satellite objects and are susceptible to environmental factors. And thus, we need to go to ground-based radars that use RF sensing to actually get the piece of information in a robust environment. Now, you might be wondering about what exactly this means. This is a geo-orbit detection. And this is very important actually because traditionally RF sensing has not worked very well for objects in the high up. And geo-orbits are objects that are around 35,000 kilometers. And the issue has been traditionally that objects that are that high, it's very hard to get the proper SNR to actually be usable. Now, how did this get changed? Well, what they did was instead of using a traditional monostatic radar, they're able to utilize a bistatic radar by utilizing a monostatic radar at first and then adding on to it a receiver by itself. Now, the important thing is the receiver by itself was able to have a much lower temperature noise, and also receivers by themselves are much cheaper than putting a receiver onto an existing transmitter. And with these receivers, they can have very high aperture sizes effectively, and that gives a much better effective the received gain that you get. And so you combine that with the fact that the power noise level is going to be much lower because of the fact that you have a much lower temperature noise. And you can see this is the MHR radar, um, which is a very high powered radar, and this is the receiver. And once we combine these two, we get a much better. And with this, we can see that this is actually able to detect when the MHR and the WSRT combined. The MHR is a radar and this is the receiver. When they combined, we're able to actually detect when the object was tumbling and the period. And the reason that this is boldened is because at a certain tumble point, the effective RCS that the radar sees is maximized, and thus it's bold. Now, this is the final part of it, which is the low Earth orbit, Doppler orbit tracking using RF sensing. Now, what this does essentially is it shows that when you do LEO Doppler orbit tracking, the difference is that instead of using an active RF sensing like we did earlier, where you send and you receive, this one you simply like quietly look at what the actual satellite is doing. So in this case, the FC is just the internal frequency of the actual satellite. So the limitation of this case is actually that you can't just use this thing in any case where a satellite is inactive. This can only work if your satellite is currently an active satellite. So how this works is you take in you take in the internal frequency of the satellite, you detect that, and the assumption is that you actually know what the internal frequency of the satellite is. And that can be done by using the TTC signal that all satellites have, which is the telemetry tracking and command signal, which is usually done at 2 gigahertz, and that will give you the information that you need. And the algorithm works by simply listening to the satellite and then waiting. And what it does is it has a sampling time of a certain amount of time. And what it does is it checks for the highest value and it makes sure that it isn't just a spike, you know. And once it sees like, oh, this is the highest value, it knows, hey, this is my output FO. And then it just subtracts that from the internal frequency of the satellite that it got from the TTC signal. And that gives it its FT. And you might think, well, that doesn't seem too accurate, but actually in the real case, the error that we were getting for most of these satellites was in the order of 10 to 100, but the actual Doppler frequency was in the order of thousands. So it's a very low Doppler error. So just to conclude this, RF sensing has been very instrumental and it will continue to evolve and change to actually help us in not just in geo orbits, but also in low Earth orbits as well.